and what we could do to farm with birds was to go to lots of different farms and camp and just bird in the morning, camp and talk to the farmers and get a feel for what they were doing, how they viewed wildlife, and what birds I might see there. So here's one of the first places I went birding. I wouldn't recommend this as a birding spot to any of you if you want to see or hear anything, because inside of a patch of corn like this, it's noisy. That corn is above my head. And I saw some blackbirds in here. I saw a flicker of all things out in the cornfield, but really not much else. Certainly none of the native prairie birds. I did get quite a few woodland birds and some raptors as well. And so there are changes that have occurred in our grasslands. We've increased the structure with buildings and planting of windbreaks and shelter belts around homes in the former, grasslands. And that's benefited some birds, but it hasn't benefited grassland birds. So on this graph, you can see the results of breeding bird survey data, which started in the late 60s, early 70s, depending on where you're at. This is just for Nebraska, where I was in that cornfield, and it shows that decline in grassland birds. But that you could plot this for anywhere or for the US in general, you would see this same decline. Game birds have also declined. That's something of relevance to people in the Midwest that like to hunt quail and pheasants, even though the pheasants aren't native. Because of the loss of cover for these birds, their numbers have declined too. And many of the farmers told me the reason for this was because of all the hawks have increased. And you can see there's a slight increase in hawks there, but these are mainly woodland hawks, red-tails, red-shouldered hawks, broadwing hawks that are responding again to this increase in forested habitat. And things like the northern harrier are declining as well because they require also grasslands. So just consider for a minute here, I'm sitting in the cab of this soybean combine. We're taking the last bit of soybeans off of this field. And there is just not much habitat left after this machine goes through. This machine it's an incredible piece of technology. It calculates the moisture content of the beans as it's harvesting it. It puts the cutter right at the right level to harvest the beans and still leave some stubble in the field, which is good. So they're helping soil fertility and carbon sequestration with that by not tilling, but they're taking basically all of the cover and all of what used to be waste grain with harvest that a lot of these birds would go in and utilize. In this case, there was one rabbit in this little bit of being left as we harvested it, and that last rabbit took off and ran. He got to the trees way down here at the end, but it wasn't a good day for that bunny, I'm sure. So we can think about the reasons for these declines. Maybe some of it is due to raptors, which certainly will follow these harvesters and pick off things like that rabbit that was running, but it's not the reason for our loss of grassland birds. The reason for that are these top two lines, and that is an increase in the amount of area that's planted with industrial, basically corn and soybean rotations in the Midwest. And I think even more importantly, the dashed line shows how much of that area is now hit with herbicide, so Roundup. And you're familiar with the stories of Roundup Ready seed that farmers are planting. They can then spray it with Roundup. It kills the weeds. It doesn't hurt their crop. And so it's a really great thing for a farmer to be able to, take care of his field that way, but it's not a good thing for the insects and weeds that would be there that some of the birds would use either directly or as food for their young. And I just plot the drought index on the bottom just to show that that's not related to that decline in the birds, but the increase in herbicide and planted acreage is highly correlated with the decrease in those birds. So there I am camping in the bean field to try to get a feel for what was going on there. It was actually a pretty cool spot. There were, like I said, some good forest birds. There were owls around. There were some tree frogs and deer and other bits of wildlife, but it was pretty darn slim to see things there. And again, the increased planting and herbicidal use of our crops is the main reason for this, I think, and most other scientists think. The thing that really surprised me once I dug into this was the reasons for increased planting of corn and soybean. It's not for food. The food line on this is the red. Bart, the red part of this graph. That's the proportion of corn, in this case, that we use for food. And it stayed a very small, about 3% of all the corn we raise in the Midwest is for us to eat. The blue component, which has stayed steady at about half or so of the corn we raise, is to feed cattle and to fatten up cattle so we have fatter cuts of beef to eat on feedlots. And then the yellow, increasingly great proportion of the corn that we raise is for biofuels. And you might think that sounds good. It's not a fossil fuel, but the amount of land that's consumed to be able to grow those crops and inefficiently convert them basically to alcohol and fuel is really a waste of land in this case. There are better sources of biofuels than growing corn, but we've subsidized farmers to grow corn for biofuels in particular, and they get some increased revenue, of course, for growing it for cattle feed. And I don't blame the farmers at all. These guys were great people I met with and talked with, and they're just business people. They have to do this to make a living. They're going wherever they're getting their best amount of money for it. And that's basically to do this. And the other option you might have heard of, which is funded in the Farm Bill every year, or every several years when they reauthorize that, is the Conservation Reserve Program. And the Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to not grow things like corn and soybeans, but instead to either fallow their land sometimes, or to plant, you can select to plant pollination crops for invertebrates or cover crops for wildlife and birds. You can pick a lot of different mixes of things to do on your land. The problem is that the farmers in Nebraska that I talked with, and the amount they get paid for the Conservation Reserve Program varies from place to place on the fertility of the soil. These guys would get $138 an acre in 2017 when I talked to them if they did the CRP planning. And in contrast, they would get for soybeans $665 an acre, and for corn, $840. Now there's some costs associated with that, but it's minimal relative to the payback. So really, one of the things I learned right away in speaking with these farmers was, one, again, they're businessmen doing what they have to do to make money, but they would chase conservation sorts of plantings if that was economically feasible for them. They're not opposed to that, but it's just not worth it. So for us to lobby lawmakers and others to increase the value of the CRP subsidy that we have in the Farm Bill, instead of the subsidy for biofuels or cattle feed, that would switch people's minds and allow them to make money they need to make, and us to have some of the habitat that we'd like to see for birds. So that's one of the lessons first off. So I went from Nebraska to Montana, and this is a picture of a fallowed wheat field around Three Forks, Montana. And I went to Montana into these intensive wheat farms expecting to see basically drawdown of natural aquifers, because wheat and other intensive farming in dry parts of the world is one of the leading sources for declining aquifers, which we're all paying the price of in terms of getting water for our other uses. Well, I was surprised in this particular case to find that they don't use aquifer at all here. This is dry land farming, and it's a situation where they will let the land lay fallow for 1 or 2 years in between a couple of years of growing. And during that fallow period, water accumulates. This has been a great year there. So a lot of snowpack and rainfall will accumulate moisture in the soil and then allow them to grow a crop the next year without any kind of irrigation. And that's been very productive there for the farmers. They grow a high protein wheat because of that strategy. And it's also productive for the wildlife there. And the horned lark, our streaked horned lark here, but this is just the normal horned lark, is one of the species that really utilizes those stubble fields. And they are not, for example, provided for with CRP lands, which are typically more vegetated. And those of you who've been out looking for horned larks, you know they're usually in pretty bare ground. And that's the kind of habitat these guys like, and they get it from being able to use this wheat stubble. The other thing that surprised me there, one of the farms I went to that does this fallowing of their land also has a bakery and a bread mill. And so they make a lot of bread and bakery products, and they sell them. You can get them now all over here. It's kind of changed hands and it's gone to a much larger corporation. But they have a lot of waste bread. They take that waste bread and recompost it back to the ground, which again is good for nutrient cycling and enhancing the quality of the soil. But it also brings in a lot of birds, like ravens, which is what I'm most interested in. I've been studying ravens in Yellowstone for several years now, and I was surprised to find that one of my birds was going over here and eating this farmer's bread. Unbeknownst to me, I was kind of working on two different projects and they intersected. So I'll show you just a little bit of data from these ravens that we've tagged in Yellowstone Park. So here's a bird. All these dots you see here, the purple dots, are locations of a bird wearing a GPS radio backpack that communicates with the cell network and tells us where the bird's at. Basically, this bird texts me its location every half hour. And so here we are down in Yellowstone where we tagged it initially, and it follows a course up here going by these mountains. They're the Crazy Mountains. It comes over by Bozeman along I-90 and finally heads up here and concentrates its time around those wheat fields. This was a juvenile when I tagged her 3 years ago. Last year, she bred for the first time in this exact same spot. But if you look underneath this cloud of points, you start seeing the wheat country. Some of it's irrigated and some of it's the dry land farming. And right underneath where this bird was spending all its time is this farmland. So they're utilizing the resources there, whether it's the compost or other waste products that the farms have there, the ranches have there. And as I said, she's settled in and established a breeding territory there now. So that was a little aside, sorry, but it's fun to see how different projects interrelate sometimes. One of the next farms I went to were vineyards in California. And we're doing some of this here in Washington, but it's profound in California, where vineyards are putting out all kinds of bird boxes to get birds in to eat insects and to eat rodents that are tearing up their vines and also the soil where they're trying to run their machinery. So this box here is a barn owl box that was installed by Matt Johnson, one of my friends at Humboldt State University. And Matt's been monitoring the use of these boxes, and others have been monitoring the use of boxes by kestrels in these vineyards as a pest control strategy. So here's one of Matt's owls. We were just getting ready to band it. She was in that box. Ravens are kind of hard to catch, but barn owls are pretty easy. You put a sock on the hole in the box and you reach in and grab them and you've got them. But really cool that they have found out that these animals are able to consume about 1,000 gophers a year as they're raising a brood of 4 young in these boxes. That's a significant benefit for the farmers that they don't have to control. They don't have to spend money to control that. Plus they get a neat PR story. So it's a real win-win situation. Farmers benefit, owls benefit. And again, their farmers are super willing to do this sort of thing because it's helping them. It's not costing them. So looking for those sorts of situations where we can have these win-win situations is important. Just down the road in California, rice farmers there, rather than burning their fields to ready them for the next planting, to basically get rid of the residue of the rice plant after the harvest has been completed, they're flooding them now. And we get scenes like this with stilts and ibis in these fields using the invertebrates that are growing in these fields. And I don't know if you guys have been to Eastern Washington lately, but I was there yesterday and we saw about 12 stilts just off of the Columbia now. So these birds are coming through our habitats now as well. And then I went to some places in Western Washington. One closer to my house is the Oxbow Conservation and Farm Center. And I studied these yellowthroats, common yellowthroats that breed there. They're quite common. And the reason, again, that they're able to survive there in this farm, and this is an organic farm. It's subsidized by the owners that have made a lot of money in other industries. And they basically set up an organic farm that's able to be self-sufficient, but not to have had to purchase the land and the farm to start. That's the big hurdle for a lot of these smaller, especially organic farmers. My daughter is one of those. She rents land on Vashon and raises crops there. She can make a fine living with what she raises and sells, but she can't make enough basically to buy the land outright because of the land costs, especially in places like Western Washington. So this is another example of that, where a benefactor basically purchased the land and then set up a basically farming situation for others to come in and do the farming and live off of what they're able to make. But what struck me here was the abundance of birds there. The yellowthroats were just one example. They were there in the breeding season, along with several species of sparrows and towhees and all the usual suspects that you would have kind of around a field edge here. But the yellowthroats in particular caught my attention because I hadn't really seen them in the suburbs that I studied around the Seattle area as well. They are not a species that we see in the remnant woodlands, but in these open areas and especially places that they let go fallow, like this field of grass here that the farmers delayed cutting because we found the yellowthroats using this to basically as their family fledgling rearing areas. The farmers would gladly not cut this. It was just a place in the field that they were letting go fallow. They weren't growing a crop on it. And they let it go a little longer than they would have liked to. So the habitat, the grass was there for the yellowthroats to complete their breeding cycle and raise their fledglings in it. Lots of bugs there and lots of space for these birds. So there's lots of fun things that happen in these organic settings, spreading manure here, the farmer and his kid enjoying a day together. And as I said, this is kind of an unusual sort of farm. They've also got a very, very strong ethic to raise native plants to help with restoration efforts along the Snohomish River, where this farm exists. So this state-of-the-art greenhouse and a botanist that's running it is basically growing plants, figuring out how to germinate seeds of many of our native species, and then sending those out to restoration projects, which probably some of you all have worked on, helping to restore habitats around the area. So you can do a lot with the land. Buying it and being able to do that's a different story. So in some of my classes, I take students to Costa Rica and we go to several farms down there. And this was one, again, motivations for me to try to understand a little bit more what these farmers were doing and how they were seeming to be quite gentle on the land and also to have an abundance of food for what they were trying to do. And so one of the first farmers that I got to know down there is Isidro here. He's the father of a couple of good friends that are tourist guides down there that I'll show you in a second. But Isidro is pretty low intensity farming. He raises young bulls, raises them for a couple of years and sells those bulls. And he does, you know, this is his tractor that he uses to get to work. Basically rides his horse down the driveway to the pasture where his bulls are. And this pasture is quite wild. You can see here a few of the young bulls with some yellow-headed caracaras foraging from their heads and their backs. They're taking bugs off of the bulls, and also the disturbance that the bulls create flushes insects that they run out and catch as well. So there's on this farm, there's over 300 species of birds that have been counted on this just a few acre farm. Here's Isidro's son, Marcos, and his wife, Jenny. And another thing I found often on these smaller farms is a way that farmers had to come up with some way to diversify their income. So while these Isidro and his kids raise a variety of plants for local consumption, beans, corn, all the things they need, and the bulls. They also have set up an English school to tutor English people in Spanish language and Spanish people in English language, and a vibrant now ecotourism group. And so they host university groups like mine that would come down there and stay at their farm, learn a bit about their techniques, and then we would go off birding and nature looking with Marcos and Jenny. So they're certified guides. That brings in some additional funding. Having people stay on their place brings in additional funding and allows them to make it. And they're not the only ones. This is a very small community of Mastatal, Costa Rica. Have any of you guys been? How many of you been to Costa Rica? I should say first. A few. Any to Mastatal? Ever heard of it? Yeah. I mean, this is way off the beaten track. There's 100 people that live in this small village, but 3 of them have these diverse eco farms. This is Jorge, and Jorge and his family have raised chocolate for decades. And they now have a small artisanal chocolate situation where they make chocolate all the way from the pod, in this case, down to the bar, and sell that. They're now marketing that, so they get the value added of doing that. They give tours as well to supplement their income a bit, but theirs is almost entirely from the agricultural product. And they do some interesting ways to save water and increase the growing season with mulching using cedar leaves that they get on their property as well. But they do everything from harvesting to roasting to making the chocolate bars, and it's quite fun to go there and enjoy that. And then there's still one other. Javier and Rachel live right against one of the newest national parks in Costa Rica, which is right adjacent to this small hamlet of Mastatal. La Cangreja is the name of the national park. And if you want to go birding in a good spot where you will see nobody else, this would be the national park to go to in Costa Rica. It again, their Christmas bird count usually boasts 450 to 500 species, and there is nobody on the trails in this national park. I wouldn't say the trails are especially easily traversed. They are rugged and not well maintained, but it's worth it to get through some of that to basically have paradise like this to yourself. But Javier and Rachel have specialized. They initially were farmers. They've gone way more to the ecotourism route now. Marcos and Jenny kind of in between. These guys way on the end where they have cabins for local Costa Ricans to come and stay, and then go and spend a day in the national park, and then come and spend a day or 2 on the farm here and have a nice vacation and go to waterfalls and things like that. But the birds are spectacular, and they spill out of the national park and come into Javier's yard and the rest of Mastatal as well. This is a collared forest falcon, which is a great bird to see and very common to see in the more open areas around the farms. They're hard to see in the forest because it's so dense, but you get them in a more open spot like this and get a good look. So these people have been very low intensity farmers. So they have a lot of land that's scrubby and not farmed on a given time. They don't have a lot of animals on the land. They don't have a lot of it cropped. They leave a lot of it fallow. They benefit from having wildlife on their land because the people who come to see the natural history of Costa Rica get to see it right there as well. So again, it's this win-win situation. And this is an example of what academics call land sharing. So sharing the land with wildlife rather than sparing, which is the alternative that you might have heard voiced, is basically to have reserves where we set aside a place entirely for nature, and then the rest of the place is set aside entirely for people and our industrial needs. And this kind of tension between sharing or sparing land drove me to try to understand that a bit more here. And I saw very clearly that sharing the land was beneficial, not only for people in this case, but also for the wildlife there, as opposed to sparing it, where yes, you need reserves like La Cangreja that manage to provide for some species, but they don't allow for a lot of human benefit from that, except for the few farms and others that have taken advantage of kind of being a gateway community for this emerging park. So the sparing versus sharing option, it seems to me, is tilted for these small farms much more towards sharing as an economically viable thing for farmers, as well as biologically viable for wildlife. So one more place in Costa Rica. And this is a case of a man named Jack Ewing, whose picture I show you here. And Jack went down to Costa Rica in the 50s, in 1970, simply to ranch cattle. He got a degree from Colorado State in cattle rearing, and went down to Costa Rica to raise hamburger for McDonald's, basically. And he did that very successfully for a while, but he started to notice that the wildlife on his land was having trouble moving through it. And basically the situation, oops, sorry, let me go this way. The situation in Costa Rica was one of this, where there was a bit of a reserved area, the forest that you see here, and then there was much open pasture. And that's the situation when Jack first got down there, and the wildlife, monkeys in particular that he saw, couldn't cross that open area without getting harassed by dogs, or if they were things like, he talks about a ocelot that went through his land and that was easily killed by hunters because of the open terrain. So he wanted to do something to change that. And in Costa Rica and a lot of tropical places, they make fences out of living stakes. So stakes of trees they'll plant, they'll then sprout, they'll grow into a thick hedge. And usually it's one or maybe two rows of stakes to do that. Jack started doing 3 to make it a little wider as a travel corridor. This was, again, before conservation planning and that sort of thing was talked about at all. And he basically just did it because he wanted to, allow these animals to move through his land more peacefully. Well, he did that and he finally gave up ranching, and this is what his place looks like today. So if I go back one slide for you, just so you can see, here's the river and here's that forested highland area, and then here's all the bare pasture land. If you look at it now, here's the river coming in along the side. This is all the area that was bare, and it's all now been revegetated in the last several decades. And now he has basically allowed nature just to reclaim that land. They've given up entirely on ranching cattle and instead ranch tourists, and make a lot more money ranching tourists than they ever did ranching cattle. So this was a situation where Jack, he would tell me that he never had any intention on being a conservationist. He didn't even know what that word was when he went down there. He was a cattleman. But he gradually grew into accepting his role as a conservationist and has been recognized widely for the good he's done for the land down there. So back to Montana for some ranching. So we're moving around quite a bit, but I get something different from each of these places. So in Costa Rica, I really saw the benefit of again, multitasking on the land, doing some sort of conservation and tourism as well as farming. Going back to Montana, the situation here in the traditional ranch community is having to live with these carnivores, which are now expanding populations, wolves and grizzly bears, mainly from Yellowstone for these ranchers, and now coming onto their lands, and they're having to deal with them. So I worked with the folks here at J. Barrell Ranch, Andrew Anderson, Malou Anderson, and Hillary Anderson. Are basically second generation ranchers here, and they're young people, younger than us, and they are trying to ranch with methods that allow them to live with the carnivores that are coming on their lands. This is the setting, the Centennial Mountains. There are fences there. I thought these fences were mainly to keep cattle out of the adjacent Red Rocks National Wildlife Refuge. They weren't. The fences are there to keep the cattle in the refuge so they can intensively graze paddocks one at a time, and then rotate between these intensively grazed areas. This is called rotational grazing, and it's a strategy that was developed in South Africa first, primarily to try to emulate how wildebeest and other animals like our bison would come through and reduce grass cover quite a bit, and then move on to another place, and then eventually circle back to that original grazed area and graze it again after the grass had regrown. These guys are trying to simulate that with cattle, and to do that, you need a lot of pastures that you can move the cattle between. That means you have to spend a lot of time with your cows and get to know your cattle and watch your cattle, so that if a grizzly's in the area, you can react to that. If the pack of wolves are in the area, you can react to that. And that's what they do. By having much closer contact with their animals, they're able to anticipate problems and head them off often before they become a real problem. This area also has several sage grouse leks. So the ranching that's occurring there, intensive as it is compatible with sage grouse breeding, which is not something that happens everywhere. They're not only ranching in a way that's good for the land, they're trying to do it in a way that's good for their animals. I mean, you have to handle your animals if you're going to ranch them. In this case, this was a rodeo, basically a roundup where they basically got the calves away from their mothers, inoculated them, and branded them. And in this case, rather than initially separating, having all the calves in one place and the mothers somewhere else, and there's a lot of stress there with the calves being away from their mothers, they let them stay together in the pen, and they just fish out individual calves to work on, and immediately let them go, and they're still in the same pasture with their mom, and they regroup very quickly. And this is called a low stress handling method, one of the aspects of it. The other is the way they catch the calves. Instead of just throwing one lasso over them and dragging them down, they throw two on them, one in the front, one in the back, and hold them still. Then the guys that you see here run out, grab the calf, put it down on the ground so they can do the various surgeries or inoculations, whatever they have to do. So yeah, it's rough, but it's better than the alternative, and better for the calves than the alternative. And these cows are raised entirely on grass, much like bison. So rather than sending them to feedlots at some point to be fattened up on that corn that we've grown all over the Midwest, they just raise them on the pastures that are there. And they time the breeding and the movement of the animals to be in sync with the grass production, which is also a little different than the typical sort of ranching where you try to get your calves as big as possible by the end of the year so you can send them back to the Midwest. So you end up with a leaner cut of meat, but it's 100% grass finished. So if you're looking, this is certainly, I think, much better for the land. And if you're looking for steaks to eat, I would encourage you to look for grass finished, not just grass fed, because grass fed often means the rest of the diet is corn back in the Midwest. Look for grass finished beef, like theirs and others you can find in our stores now. And so this is Hillary, Andrew's wife. She was a wildlife biologist before she married and started ranching with Andrew. So she brings that skill set to the team, and has worked with her sister-in-law Malou to set up cooperatives among ranchers in the Centennial Valley here, and also in the Tom Miner Basin by Yellowstone, to basically try out and learn and gain trust among one another to try some of these non-lethal ways to coexist with carnivores. And it's a slow go. It is not easy to convince a third or fourth generation Montana rancher not to shoot a wolf that's in with his calves. But they've made some progress with that, with using some deterrents like electric fencing and things like that, that work. And the ranchers that are their neighbors that they're now on a trustworthy basis with are starting to listen to them and change some of their ways. And I visited this ranch every year for the past 18, 20 years. And the response of the neighbors as I drive up in there each year is more and more to have these non-lethal means, to have flaggery around their calving pens and things like that, which you just didn't see before. So one other rancher in Montana, very traditional, Tom Malesnek is the father here, and John his son. They raise Black Angus. They do it in a very traditional way. They send their calves at the end of the year, their animals to the Midwest to fatten up. But they do something a little different also. So even these traditional, very much, in fact, I took Tom out to dinner one time, and he would not order grass-finished beef. He said he just don't like it. Just not going to eat it. And I don't think he really cared about the taste. It was just the attitude was, no, I'm not going to do that. But he does some other things with his land to basically allow it to have productive streams. We often hear about cattle ranching destroying streams, especially in arid areas. So this is not a particularly arid area, but Tom's done some innovative things like these gravel bars, which go across the stream. He's actually put pavement lining material underneath the riverbed, then covered it with gravel, and allows the stream to move through that. The cattle want to go to the graveled area to get a drink instead of in the mud that gets up all on their legs, so they don't tear up the stream. They don't silt it. And he's got a trophy trout stream, 3 of them actually on his property that are spring-fed creeks that are completely compatible with his intensive and more traditional grazing sort of means. This is one of the things he does. The other is he also uses this high-intensity rotational grazing that I talked about from the ranchers in the Centennial Valley. But he'll even have areas right along the stream that are fenced off as paddocks. He'll put his cattle in there for 6 hours only, so that they immediately graze down the most palatable grass that's there, which also happens to be an invasive species. And they take that out and they leave the sharper native sedges, which the cattle don't want to eat necessarily. They will eventually, but if you only leave them for a short period of time, they take out the invasives. The reed canary grass is the invasive there, and they leave the sedge. So he's able to change the composition of the vegetation around the streams as well. And all of that benefits his trout. And things like these bobolinks, which are, again, a rare species in grasslands that are declining especially with grazing sorts of activities. And they are doing fine on Tom's land. There are a lot of them there. Here's a male with a recent fledgling in this bit of wheat that's one of the crops they were growing. So unfortunately, Tom, who is a second-generation rancher, had to sell the property because, as often happens in our Intermountain West, the value of the land becomes so much greater than the agricultural value. So not only is it hard for young farmers to get in, it's hard for older farmers to stay in when their family, that in this case owned, his brothers and sisters owned the land with him. And when their dad died, they had to make a decision to let Tom continue farming and make a little bit of money, or to sell it and make a lot of money. And they sold it. And Tom tried to keep it, but couldn't in this case. And that's a common theme in the West. I'm sure you are all familiar with that sort of thing. And it's a way that could lead to detrimental land use, but it can also lead to conservation of those lands as well. But more not the sharing, but the sparing kind of land, which in this case, this land now is spared because a conservationist bought it, but it's not also producing anything for people in this case, except for the one owner and his friends that come and enjoy the land. And so it's closed off the access and the ability of the public, I think, to bond more closely with some of these natural resources, fish in this case. But that situation where you're sharing the land and making money off of it and allowing not only the farmer, but those others that come to it to benefit from that bond, I think is a much more sustainable path than locking it up. Okay, so let me summarize with a few takeaways that I gleaned from the scientific literature. Basically, there are 3 things that scientists suggest that we can do that really will allow us to produce more from our agricultural lands, because our population is increasing. Spoiler alert, I know, but it's increasing. It's going to increase. We're becoming richer, more affluent, which means we want better food. We want more protein in our diets around the world. That's a challenge, a huge challenge for agricultural lands. So 3 things they suggest that we can do to meet this demand of increasing need for food for people. 1, use all the technologies we can to basically get the most production from the land we're using. That production land, a lot of cases, a little bit of technology of where to apply fertilizer or how much water to apply can really increase the yield. Or using even genetically modified plants, but if they are modified to produce more, not necessarily to allow us to spray them with Roundup, but to produce more, those can be very beneficial to filling this yield gap, it's called. The second thing is just wasting less. We waste 1/3 of all of the crops we grow now. And there are many ways to reduce that in terms of transportation, storage, and how we use it in our own home. And at worst case, compost what you can't eat, as opposed to just letting it go back to the landfills. And then reducing the inclusion of grain-fed ruminant meat in our diets. You don't have to be vegans. That would be great. We could do a lot more if everyone is a vegan. I'm not, and I wouldn't preach that you have to be, and these folks don't either. They basically suggest a reduction in things like beef, goat, and sheep can greatly reduce our carbon footprint in this case. So let's look at these. Closing the yield gap. I mentioned some of the technologies that are available now to precisely add the exact amount of nitrogen needed or phosphorus needed in the soil for increased fertility without having too much and having the runoff associated with that pollute our streams. There are great technologies to do that and to do water and that sort of thing. And even traditional breeding or methods that allow us to genetically modify plants to increase productivity, but selective breeding, for example, with some drought tolerant crops to have greater fine root mass to absorb more water. Those kinds of breeding programs are very successful. Wasting less, like I said, there's lots of ways to do this. You may have seen some of the blemished fruit sales or vegetable sales that occur where you can get things that don't look pretty, but still taste fine. Basically there are some simple things like, this was one that kind of surprised me, but if you go to a buffet, so buffets can reduce wastage tremendously just by having smaller plates than having big plates, because we're going to fill up the big plate, and we probably won't eat it all. And a lot of that goes back to waste. And if smaller plates can make another trip, you can still eat all you want, but that's a way to reduce waste that otherwise is too easy to do. And then composting, where you basically have no other alternative to use these resources, compost them to increase soil fertility and all of that. And then adjusting our diet, grass-finished beef or bison, salmon that's wild, those sorts of things provide healthy foods for us. They have a much less demand on the ecosystem in terms of the land required to grow the food for them, and also the carbon produced by them and that land conversion. And the kind of diets these researchers suggest, they're not I don't think bad at all when you think about what you might have to give up. Basically what they're suggesting is a several thousand calorie per person per day diet that limits red meat to 1 serving a week, white meat to a half a portion a day, and dairy to a single portion a day. Just that would have the amount of greenhouse gas that we produce, and still be able to support our growing population over the next 50 years or so. So it doesn't take a lot to make a big difference in this case. And so beyond those things that you can get from the literature, that I'm not an expert in, but they make sense to me, is what I saw with the farmers that I talked to, how important it was to get to know them, to get to know what they do with their land, not just they're organic or they're this or that, but how do they treat predators on their lands? Do they leave a little bit of extra land for deer or other wildlife, whatever it may be? Do they even know what birds they have on their land? Do they use them to work for them, like some of the vintners in California and Washington do? Those are the sorts of questions you can ask farmers when you get to know them, and you can do that at farmers markets and other places. We're getting much more information now at stores about the attitudes of farmers and ranchers that we buy our food from, where they tell us about those farms, and that can help, but nothing really substitutes for getting to know them and really developing a rapport with your community-based agricultural producers, which we have a lot here in Western Washington. You're lucky to be able to make those kind of connections with an awful lot of the food that is available at farmers markets here. So here's a picture of a farmer, Frank Mueller in California, and an agroecologist, Sarah Cross, and her young son, young daughter. And they're having a conversation about exactly that. Sarah does research on Frank's land to know what are the benefits of having hedgerows for pollinating the crops that he grows. He grows most of the peppers that you would get in any sriracha product that you use, and lots of tomatoes. And he has got super high-tech water allocation technology in his fields, with where the water lines are laid out with GPS super sub-millimeter precision so that he can go and basically farm right on top of those year after year and not have to move them and accurately put the amount of water each plant needs. He gets basically an alert every day of which plants need a little more water based upon the color of their leaves. So it's very high tech, very efficient, still uses resources, uses a lot of water, but less than he would have to if he was just being less careful. He also has a lot of land that he leaves fallow and that it's just not worth him trying to farm to get a little bit more production off of. He'd rather have a pond there or habitat for birds there. And I'll leave you with a picture basically of two options. Frank's place is on the left and the neighbor's is literally on the right across the street. And what we see basically is that some farmers, like some of us who live in suburbs and other places, treat their land really more as a community. And they're part of that community and they value the benefits of the other members of that community, like pollinators in Frank's case, or like owls in some of the vintners' cases. And they value the diversity of crops or of weeds that are there because there are birds and other things there that they enjoy. And they're able to still produce a tremendous amount of food and make a good living doing that. And others don't share that. They look at their land more as a commodity, as Leopold would say, a commodity that's there just for their benefit. And the land on the right here basically is done that. And they might get a little bit more productivity out of that land, but they get none of the benefit of having hedgerows to stop soil erosion, to provide pollinators, to provide birds that are eating some of the harmful insects and those sorts of things. And basically, if we treat our land like that, we'll never learn to love it. If we treat it like Frank's done on the left here, I think we can learn, as Leopold would say, to love our land and to value the integrity and beauty of it for that sake alone, in addition to the commodity value that it also produces for us. So I will thank you for hanging in there through the problems to get us going. Hopefully everybody could hear that. I'm glad to take questions. I would just tell you again about another thing we're doing here about crows, that if you're interested in kind of following some crow behavior, or you have kids or students that are interested in that, there's an app we developed that's free that you can get to basically allow you to learn about crow behavior and track it in the birds that you're seeing out there. And it's called Crow Scientist. So go get it and enjoy it. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions?
Yep.
Are the electric vehicles making the change fast enough based on their ethanol? Or?
I think they're definitely making a change. I would guess it's some of the same market of people who want to burn biofuel. I know I did and I do. So I think that it definitely hits the people that want to have vehicles that go in that direction. There's a lot of cost to electric vehicles too. So I know that's a potential problem. Am I screwing me up?
Yeah.
But I think overall, yes, it's making a big difference. And I think with some of our lofty goals to have, half of the fleet electric in the next couple of decades, that would be amazing. That would be a huge reduction in the need to sacrifice land for biofuel. But there's also other things like algae and lots of things that people are investigating. A lot of my colleagues at the U are investigating different sources, food stocks for the fermentation process to make that. So there's multiple ways in the short term, but in the long term, yeah, certainly going to more straight electric use and having that power come from either solar or hydro in a lot of ways is going to, or wind is going to be beneficial.
What are you talking about? Your book, if I buy it from you?
I will autograph that book for you with pleasure, and it's only going to cost you $20 tonight only. I don't want to take any of those books back with me, so please, if you're interested, get one, and you can read more about the stuff in there and some of the other pieces. Any questions online or any more here?
Have you run into any of the large corporate farming that's doing any of this, or is it?
Well,
the Nebraska farmers were that. I mean, they are still family farmers, and they're, I think, third or fourth generation, the guys that are working my in-laws' land now. But they're in the same mold. They basically have to get their seed from Cargill, they have to get their Roundup from them, their fertilizer from them, everything comes from one basic shop. And they cannot break out of that mold because of the subsidies, the way they're tilted, basically to favor them to use those products and grow those plants. And I mean, I don't know how we ever get out of this cycle, to be honest, but the Farm Bill is one place to start. It doesn't seem that expensive to reduce the subsidy for biofuels or cattle feed and increase the subsidies for conservation lands, and or at least make it equal. So the farmer can make a choice based upon their interests rather than the pocket, still make the same. But I don't know, it's gonna take, it's gonna take a revolution, basically, of how we allocate funds in the Farm Bill to do that. And things have improved. There's definitely more money for conservation in the Farm Bill that's being talked about right now. But that's a very important piece of legislation that I never knew or cared much about at all, you know, as a birder. I never really thought about it, but that's where a lot of this really subsidization hits the road and changes how the land's used. You can't blame the guys that are doing it. They're just trying to make a living. But the politicians that are favoring those sorts of industries by doing this are not doing the same things.
Yeah, change takes a long time. I grew up in Missouri, and just to say these kind of changes take a long time. I grew up in Missouri in the early to mid '70s when I was spending summer jobs out there on the big farmlands and mowing everything from property line to property line. And I remember maybe a 72 to 75, somewhere in there, the whole idea of leaving some hedgerow, leaving some property line vegetation up just started to, be talked about. And people started to do it. But now you look back and that's 50 years ago, right? So if we're still having the same conversation today, trying to convince people, especially large aggregate farmers, to adopt that behavior, that just shows how slow the process it is. And you just wonder to yourself, how can that be sped up? Is there a magic bullet anywhere that can move that along and make that more of a process?
Yeah. I would say the one thing that I saw out there that gave me some hope, and it's not a very hopeful scene to go look at that. I mean, there isn't a lot of natural habitat. There is some, but what I did see was young farmers that have the attitude of wanting to share with wildlife. Whether they can break into that scene in a big way in the Midwest, I don't know, but they can in a lot of other places. Whether it's around here where you've got small farms and people will pay a premium for, kind of hand produced goods in this case. I think we have if we as consumers want that and dictate that, the farmers, young farmers are glad to do it. They're glad to spend the time on the farm and do the work and, produce the produce. They feel very good about what they produce. And as long as we consumers are valuing that and they're getting paid for it, then I think there's a much more of a revolution now with farming than when I was growing up, right where you were in the same time frame there in the Midwest. And some, one of the ranchers that do the grass finished feed, Hillary told me some things just change 1 kilo at a time. And that's just what it takes, is generational turnover or 3 or 4. In some of these cases, to start seeing some of these new ideas actually having a larger impact. But it is not going to be easy in the Midwest. I mean, that land is really work. And it's got room for a lot more wildlife.
Do you feel a second Dust Bowl is in the future?
A second Dust Bowl, It sure could be, although a lot of the farmers, this is one thing that has changed a lot in the Midwest, they are not tilling the land. A lot of them are not. They are leaving stubble on the land. That field that I was in the combine taking the peas, they didn't till that land. They were gonna plant right on top of that stubble next year. And so there isn't gonna be a lot of soil loss. And that stubble is gonna degrade and increase carbon content in soil. And they're concerned about that. So I think those attitudes have changed because that makes money. They don't have to plow, they don't have to fertilize as much. And so they want to do that. And it's, there's no inertia there. So I don't think a dust bowl so much as a extinction bowl. There, that's going to be the bigger problem. So just a total change of the community of birds from prairie birds to forest birds. In a lot of that.
Climate change enters in on that too.
Yeah, it does, and it certainly makes some of those strategies a lot less tenable there. They have, of course, crop failure insurance that they get at a discount if they're growing the things that they're subsidized to grow. That's one of the biggest subsidies. So they're a little resilient to that, and they're not too open to that idea, which is surprising to me, because right after I was in Nebraska, they had these big floods a few years ago. You might remember that were, it's a weather event, but it's still probably an effect of climate change generally. And the farmers say, I know, it's just weather's always changing, it always changes. So they gotta see more consistent things.
Are ag schools teaching this to their?
Are ag schools teaching, is a question? Yeah, they are. They're certainly teaching the things like the low stress handling, the rotational grazing. Those are becoming much more mainstream. Those were young ranchers that went through that program at Montana State, where they learned that technique. And Tom, the older, more traditional rancher, had teaching at the university there. And some of the ag schools in the Midwest, I mean, I think they're still focused on, how do you make the most money with corn and soybeans, but there are alternatives that are being tried. Again, it's just going to take a different sort of person on the land to start making that change. Being able to afford the land is a big problem. I mentioned it a few times. There are programs to help farmers that are retiring get their land in the hands of young farmers that want to do it and still be able to maintain farming, but be able to make some money. And for young farmers to get loans and things like that more easily to purchase the land. But that's an area that could be worked on to make this change a lot faster. You see any questions online? They have everything. Okay, they're gone. Anyway, thank you very much. If there's no other questions.
Could you tell us a little about your book?
Sure, I just did.
Meadowlarks.
It is, that's what I just talked about, is basically the farms that are in this book, and some more. But yeah, the same basic thing, that was my journey to try to understand a bit what's going on farms, what we might do to be able to make it better. And what some of the other experts, because again, my field is mostly suburban ecology and responsive birds to timber harvest and things like that. Not so much agriculture. I've done a little bit of personal work there, but not a lot. It was more motivated by my daughter trying to make a living doing this, and my in-laws having made a living doing this for a long time. And then with the trips I take to Costa Rica and these places, we see other kinds of, you see another way to farm. And I wanted to understand why that wasn't necessarily the case here and what might be done. So that's the basic. Yeah.
Did you hear that Ukraine is the breadbasket? Do they farm differently there?
They're going to be perhaps a little less intensive in some of those areas, but the nations that joined the EU, places like Ukraine and Poland that were very much agricultural, the intensification of agriculture there shot up tremendously when they joined the EU, because they were also getting subsidies to do these same sorts of things, high intensity farming, to sacrifice that area, to basically use that area for the production in spare areas elsewhere in the Alps or whatever it may be. So the share versus spare was forced in the EU as it has been in the Midwestern US. Basically, is that this is the farming area, this, and you're gonna farm the heck out. And to some extent, I mean, we have to do some of that. But they did a much lower intensity farming before joining the EU, and I don't have the graph here. I mentioned it in the book, but basically the bird populations, they documented the decline in bird populations with in the Czech Republic, in this case, when we joined the EU, because of that increased industrialization. Yeah, good question.
Good, thank you very much.
All right,